Hey, Dr. Segrin here, and today we are going to be talking more about global warming. Specifically, we'll be talking more about the causes of man-made global warming. So let's get right into it. So let's do a little recap first of what we learned in the last lecture, where we really just talked about kind of Earth as a climate system and as a heat system and sort of the history of Earth and all the climate changes that had happened with Earth. Let's kind of review that for a second. We talked about how overall the temperature has been going up and up and up in the last 100-ish years, but really it's been accelerating pretty quickly in the last 40 years. So depending on what you call zero, and zero being average for Earth, and again, Earth is constantly changing, so what we kind of consider average is sort of this zone from 1940 to 1960, it seems like, that sort of time period. But before that time, it was a little bit cooler. So anyway, regardless of that, we can see that maybe we were in a slight warming trend for, about 100 years here. And then in 1980, it's kind of picking up. So that's global warming. We learned that obviously Earth is getting hotter. We also talked some about how pretty much the entire climate system of Earth is dictated by heat. So as things heat up on Earth, this is what causes the wind to blow. Pretty much every wind current on Earth is determined by the buildup of heat. And the same happens in the ocean. So you get these ocean currents based off heat, and most of it is driven by the process of convection. Hot air tends to rise, cold air tends to sink. So when you have these buildups of hot air, hot water in different parts of the world, you get this circulation pattern. And that's all just to kind of show that as you add, it might not seem that big of a deal. Okay, so what? The temperature's gone up a degree, in the last 40 years. Big whoop. I mean, so what? It's a little bit hotter outside. That's not that big of a deal. But when you consider that every ocean current and every wind current is controlled by heat, it could be a considerably big deal and has the potential to change all sorts of things on planet Earth in terms of how heat is circulated. And that's a topic we will talk about more in a later lecture. We also put Earth in the context of history, and we talked about ice ages and how Earth has had ups and downs in its history in terms of warmer periods and colder periods, which are more like ice ages. So we have this up and down trend, but we see that these up and down trends relate very closely to patterns that we see of greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide. And I talked about how these gases trap heat on Earth and how human activities in the last 100 years or so have pretty much taken these gases off of the chart. And so we are in places, there are currently more carbon dioxide and methane, these greenhouse gases, in the atmosphere than pretty much any time in the last million plus years. And we're assuming that that heat trend is going to continue rising up along with these greenhouse gases. And the way these greenhouse gases trap heat is that basically sunlight hits Earth, that heats up Earth and creates warmth, but also generates something called infrared radiation. That radiation generally will dissipate back out into space and we get this nice balance. But if you have too many greenhouse gases, what happens is that this escaping energy gets re-reflected back to Earth, and it's kind of acts like a heat lamp on Earth, if you want to think of it that way. We also saw this in the little virtual lab experiment that we did, showing that indeed methane and carbon dioxide do trap heat when you put them under a heat lamp. So that was just a little recap. Earth is heating up, almost certainly because of the greenhouse effect caused by greenhouse gases. The amount of greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere are way outside of the normal range, And let's talk about, okay, why is that happening? What exactly are humans doing that are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide and methane that are in the atmosphere? Well, first, let's talk about what are carbon dioxide and methane. Carbon dioxide is CO2, and I think from here on out in the slides, it's going to be called CO2, not carbon dioxide. So don't get confused. If you see CO2, that's carbon dioxide. And methane is CH4. So let's talk about where these things come from. Carbon dioxide is produced by pretty much everything on Earth. Any living organism on Earth produces carbon dioxide, just about. There are some exceptions, but plants, animals, fungus, most bacteria, they all produce carbon dioxide. And you produce carbon dioxide when you breathe out. So you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide, so does every other animal. So part of your breath is CO2. CO2 is also produced, the other big way that it's produced is basically when you burn anything. So anytime anything catches fire, it pretty much releases carbon dioxide, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Methane is actually produced by only certain kinds of bacteria. It's called methanogenesis. Some bacteria, when you take oxygen away from them, they will still consume food, but they'll do it in a way that instead of producing CO2, like most things do, they will produce methane. And so when you consider what sort of environments are bacteria deprived of oxygen in, generally it's kind of, I just think, swampy areas. So if you go underneath this water into this mud of this swamp, you can imagine that probably not much oxygen is there, but it's loaded with, swampy stuff, dead plants, dead animals, dead anything, all this kind of buildup of food and energy resources. So bacteria still want to eat that stuff, but they don't have any oxygen. And so as they're eating this stuff without oxygen, they are kind of burping out methane. So that's the primary kind of biological way that methane is created in the natural world. So both of these substances are natural. They occur in nature, so they're not completely man-made in that sense, but humans in our activities release a lot more of this carbon dioxide and methane than would normally be there. And last but not least, actually, methane is natural gas. So if you have a stove top that looks like this, what's actually coming out of here and that you're catching on fire is methane. So methane is actually a fossil fuel. It is natural gas. So it does occur underground. Humans dig it up and then we use it as an energy resource. But sometimes in the process of digging that stuff up out of the ground, some gets released into the atmosphere. So hopefully that gives you some context on these two molecules and where they come from. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how specifically humans make them. But there are also another couple molecules that are greenhouse gases that I haven't covered yet. So here is our overall, if we look at all of the global warming caused by all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, this is the breakdown. About roughly 80%, 76% of global warming is caused by carbon dioxide. About 16% is caused by methane, and then a couple tiny slivers, but they're tiny, but they're not completely negligible, would be nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases. And I'll get into what that other category is in a moment. But nitrous oxide is also a substance that's produced by bacteria. Bacteria will break down sources of nitrogen, what we would consider organic nitrogen. So things that are typically in animal waste, fertilizer, that sort of thing. And most of the human produced nitrous oxide is actually indirectly produced by bacteria that are eating the fertilizer that we are putting on farms. So we use fertilizers in our farms. That fertilizer has nitrogen. Usually it's made of something like ammonia, which is NH3. And these bacteria basically can eat this ammonia. And in the process, they kind of burp out nitrous oxide, which I believe is N2O. And so nitrous oxide, in our soils, in our farms, basically, these bacteria are releasing this stuff as they eat our fertilizer. But regardless, if we didn't put the fertilizer on the farm, then the bacteria wouldn't have the fertilizer to eat. So we're causing that nitrous oxide to be released. And then the last one, which is the smallest category, these other greenhouse gases. Typically, these are known, you might have heard of CFCs, which are chlorofluorocarbons, or generally another category, sometimes they're called fluorinated gases. These are used in a variety of different ways, but I think the most common ones are refrigerants, so things that we use for refrigerators or cooling off things, air conditioning and all that stuff. Those gases, like Freon, you might have heard of, like replacing the Freon in your car or your air conditioning. Those gases, we have to be very, very careful with them, because when they are released, they are powerful, powerful global warming gases. And anybody who's worked in the air conditioning business or as a mechanic knows how careful you have to be with those gases. That's the reason why. Speaking of which, now that we've kind of given our overview of these greenhouse gases with carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then this big other category, which are our fluorinated gases, our CFCs, and our other fluoro whatevers, we can begin to understand kind of a bigger picture. So these are the names here and the chemical formula. This shows the concentration in the atmosphere. And so when you have a really high number, that means there's a lot of it in the atmosphere. So you can see that carbon dioxide, that's a pretty high number, 358,100,000 parts per billion. Methane, 1721. So there's considerably more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than methane. Nitrous oxide, there's even less of. And then the CFCs and everything else, these are 0 point. So there is just a very tiny, like the amount of this is unbelievably small compared to the amount of carbon dioxide. Yet they still contribute a pretty large amount to global warming. I mean, 2% is small, but when you look at this fraction, 0.5 to 380,000, I mean, that's way smaller than 2%. And the reason for that discrepancy of why these gases they're super rare, but they are super potent or powerful. And the way we measure that is this term called global warming potential here. Carbon dioxide, we say, is 1. Methane, for each molecule of methane that makes it into the atmosphere, it does 21 times more work compared to carbon dioxide in terms of how much heat it traps in the atmosphere. So you can see that all else being equal, if we can reduce the amount of methane compared to CO2, that could potentially make a really big difference, because methane is so much more powerful than carbon dioxide. It's 21 times more powerful at trapping heat compared to carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is a whopping 310 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So those farms that are using all this fertilizer and all these bacteria are breaking it down and releasing nitrous oxide. You know, it doesn't have to be very much of it to make a pretty big impact on global warming. And then even more so for these fluorinated gases. CFCs, something like Freon, I believe, would be in this category, something in the ballpark of 6,000 to 7,000 times more powerful than just normal carbon dioxide. So releasing one of these molecules into the atmosphere is like releasing 7,000 molecules of carbon dioxide. So it's really, really bad. And if you happen to be a mechanic or you work in the AC business, do not take those regulations about working with Freon lightly. It is very, very important that you don't release this stuff into the atmosphere. So there's just an overview on the importance of each one of these gases and how much they contribute to global warming. So let's now go into a little bit more detail on where these gases are coming from. We talked about nitrous oxide and the fluorinated gases, where those come from, farming and refrigerators and refrigerants and air conditioning. But we haven't talked about, okay, where does all this carbon dioxide? I mean, clearly the bulk of climate change, we're estimating 76% of climate change is due to carbon dioxide. And again, carbon dioxide is a very weak global warming gas compared to the other ones. So we must be producing massive, massive amounts of carbon dioxide. And yes, we are. The first way, and we'll go through the different ways we produce carbon dioxide, is basically with agricultural practices. So a combination of things like deforestation. So we haven't talked a lot about human populations, but all humans on Earth need food. And as the human population increases, we need to generate food, and we need to generate more and more farmland. One of the ways that's done, unfortunately, is basically by cutting down forest, and that's called deforestation. And sometimes, but not always, the way that these forests are cut down, the most efficient way to kind of get rid of all these trees is to basically light a forest fire. And so in certain places of the world, I would say Indonesia and Brazil are the biggest culprits of this. Pretty large tracts of rainforest are burned down to basically make room for farming. In the process, as all these trees are burned, again, you're burning something that is releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. At the same time, it's kind of a double whammy. Forests naturally, remember, plants breathe in carbon dioxide. So as you remove the forest, you're actually removing Earth's ability to take this greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere. So not only are you cutting down the forest and burning them, adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, but you're actually removing these trees that naturally clean the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. So it's kind of a double whammy here. And the same thing happens with other kinds of farming. So even if you're not clear cutting a forest, let's say you have a nice prairie grassland where you have this prairie species growing, and you're going to cut down and burn all this prairie, and you're going to plant just another kind of grass, wheat. For example, so this is the native prairie grass over here on the left, and this is wheat, which is a crop that we use to make flour, which we make bread and pasta and all kinds of other stuff out of. So you might not think, oh, well, what's the big deal? We're just replacing this kind of grass with another kind of grass. So who cares? But when you start studying the native natural grass, and you start looking at this plant, you see that underneath the ground, this grass is massive, and not only does that stabilize the soil and prevent erosion, but that's all taking in carbon dioxide basically to create all these roots. Remember, these plants absorb massive amounts of carbon dioxide, and they build their bodies out of that carbon. This wheat on the right just is not going to be comparable. So pretty much all of our agricultural practices, because we are killing and destroying some natural ecosystem, whether it's a forest or a grassland, because we're doing that, we are contributing a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. And this kind of brings us to this idea of carbon sinks versus sources. A carbon sink is something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, so something like a forest or this natural grassland. A carbon source is something that puts carbon into the atmosphere. And so we are basically removing the carbon sinks from the world, the forests and the natural grasslands, and replacing them with carbon sources like farms. Of course, there's also this massive culprit of burning stuff. Anytime you burn anything, you release carbon dioxide, and we burn a lot of stuff as humans. Pretty much everything we do, we burn stuff for. And what the stuff that we're burning are fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. We dig it up out of the ground and we burn it. We do it because we need electricity. That's the main way we still make electricity. We also use, oil and gas to move our vehicles around, like, cars, boats, construction equipment, planes. Pretty much every vehicle on planet Earth runs off of gasoline or some derivative of a fossil fuel. So all that stuff, every single car on the road, every single boat, every single plane, every power plant that runs off coal, oil, and gas, all of that stuff is producing large amounts of CO2. This happens to be the biggest contribution of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, is burning fossil fuels. And I think it's interesting to kind of put this into scale, just how much carbon pollution, carbon dioxide we are putting in the atmosphere. Last year, we released something like 35 billion metric tons, and a ton is, again, it's over 2,000 pounds, since this is American terms. So you're talking about 35 billion times 2,000, 70 trillion pounds or something of CO2 each year by burning coal, oil, and gas. By weight, that is the equivalent of 100,000 Empire State Buildings, something in that ballpark. These calculations I'm about to show you with the Empire State Building and the next one, I basically just did the scratch work right here before I did the video. So if these are a little off, send your hate mail to somebody else. But yes, something in the ballpark of 100,000 Empire State Buildings worth of CO2 by weight. So it's kind of hard to imagine 100,000 of these buildings lined up, and then that's all pollution that's released into the air. Another way to think about this is, instead of thinking about weight, the weight of all this, we can think about the volume. So that all that pollution is gas. And so how much gas are we really releasing into the atmosphere? And the amount that I came up with is 7,000 cubic miles of carbon dioxide. And a cubic mile would be if we made a big giant cube out of 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile, so made a giant block, and we had 7,000 of those, fill those up with carbon dioxide and then release them. That's how much we do each year. And to give you an idea of how big that cube would be, if we basically made a giant tank around the state of Connecticut, which is a pretty small state, but I mean, it's still huge. If we made a giant tank around that state that was a mile high, so imagine we made like a giant aquarium around Connecticut that had a mile high wall to it, this giant dome around it, and we filled that up with CO2. That's how much we're talking. Actually, more than that, but it would overflow that tank. So, we could drown the entire state of Connecticut with a mile of carbon dioxide with that much CO2. And we do that each year. So every year we release that much. And so you imagine that year after year after year of doing that, obviously that's going to build up a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So when we're talking about these CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels, I think it's also interesting to pause and consider what countries are doing it more so than others, and sort of what the trend is. So if you look at this overall graph, you can see, from 1700, we pretty much didn't produce any carbon dioxide to now, where we get our 35 billion tons of it. You can see pretty massive changes in the world. But these colors represent different countries, how much CO2 different countries and continents are producing. So from the bottom, you can see that Europe, these bottom two colors, the orange and the yellow square, these two colors are both Europe. Those actually had produced more carbon dioxide in the sort of 80s and 90s than they currently do. And they're actually producing a little bit less. So you can kind of see the thickness of that color is basically how much carbon dioxide. So if that band is thicker, that means they're producing more. And if the band is thinner, they're producing less. And so you can see that they are producing less carbon dioxide than they used to. Same with these European countries, a little bit less. If we look at the United States, our slice, you can see that as the slice gets kind of thicker and thicker, that means we're producing more and more. We might be producing a tad bit more than we used to, but not much. It looks like we've kind of stabilized. The overall thickness of that band is not changing too much. If we look at the rest of North America, so Mexico and Canada, that's getting a little bit bigger over time, but not a huge contribution. All of South America, so the entire continent of South America, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, all those countries, Venezuela, combined are way less than the United States by itself. So you can see the thickness of that line is very tiny. It is getting a little bit fatter and fatter over time, so that's still increasing. The same with Africa. Every country in Africa, tiny little slice of the world. So really not much pollution being produced by Africa. If you look at India, you can see not that much either, but their slice, the thickness of that slice keeps growing fatter and fatter over time. China, we can see pretty massive and drastic differences, more so than other countries. You can see China back in 1950 was just the teeniest, tinsy, tiny little slice, and so was it back in 1970 and 80. It was still a pretty tiny slice, but now it is a massive, massive slice of the amount of pollution produced. And I believe they produce more than any other country in the world currently. And then we see the rest of Asia, we follow a similar trend. The slice is small and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And overall, that gives us to this picture where the cumulative effect of all countries, all continents around the world is this increasing curve, just more and more and more carbon dioxide each year, to the point where we are currently producing 35 billion tons last year. All right, we have a couple other things to talk about with CO2. When you make concrete, way back, if you remember way back last year, I did several videos about limestone and the chemistry of limestone. But limestone is a rock, and it's made of calcium. But to make concrete, we basically need a whole bunch of limestone. We heat it up, and in the process, that releases a lot of carbon dioxide and cooks this limestone, and that ends up being what goes into concrete. So we can't make concrete without producing carbon dioxide. Okay. Other manufacturing also, you should consider as well. Steel, copper, aluminum, any kind of metal. You're basically having to melt rocks to make those metals. And technically, you could probably do it without releasing carbon dioxide, but it would be pretty hard. Typically, what we do to generate the high temperatures to melt these metals, like steel, copper, you name it, is you use something like coal or natural gas to heat this stuff up, melt it down, and then we can shape it however we want. These processes of manufacturing things, making things out of metal, also generate lots of CO2 when you consider that they need a lot of fuel to actually produce these temperatures to melt these rocks. So that pretty much covered all of CO2, the major sources of human-created CO2. That next biggest slice of global warming was actually caused by methane, this other greenhouse gas. And methane, I mentioned, was created in swampy environments by bacteria. And it just so happens that one of the leading calorie crops that's consumed worldwide is rice. And you might not know how rice is grown, but rice is grown in what's called a rice paddy. Rice is a wetland plant. It needs lots of water, and it actually needs to be partially submerged in water. And so to grow rice, we kind of have to create an artificial swamp. And remember, the bacteria in these oxygen-depleted soils in this swampy environment are going to be producing lots and lots of methane. Then everybody's favorite, the hit every year, is talking about cow farts. So technically it's more burps than farts, but it's funnier to say cow farts. Cows are these pretty crazy animals, and I showed you a blown up picture of a cow's digestive tract. Cows actually have debatably, you might have heard 2 stomachs, but debatably they have like 4 stomach sacs: the reticulum, the omasum, the rumen, and the abdomasum. They are these kind of crazy animals, but they eat grass. Grass is actually pretty hard to get nutrients out of. Humans cannot eat grass. If you ate grass, you would pretty much not get any kind of energy. You would starve to death if you can only eat grass. But cows figured a way to do it, and it's kind of crazy and gross. But basically, they eat grass, and it goes down their throat into their first stomach, and then it kind of hangs out there for a while, and then they sometimes will throw it back up into their mouths and chew it some more. and then swallow it again, and then do that multiple times. So it's called chewing their cud. You'll sometimes see just cows kind of just chewing, and they're not actually eating any new grass. They're just kind of chewing their old grass that they're barfing up into their mouths. And then they swallow it again, and finally it goes down into their intestines, and they can extract some nutrients out of it. But this process creates a very kind of swampy environment inside of the cow. I mean, if you imagine this grass in the stomach kind of mixed with all these stomach juices and water and kind of breaking down and getting chewed on, it's a pretty nasty, swampy environment, and bacteria like it a lot. So loads of bacteria live in their stomachs, and those bacteria actually help break down this grass. But in the process, this cow burps out huge amounts of methane. They are just like methane producers, unbelievable amounts of methane, 75 gallons a day. So imagine, one of those massive trash cans full of methane. Actually, it's even bigger. The big city trash cans in Houston are 50-gallon trash cans, so even more than that. So you could fill up you could fill up 1.5 of those trash cans each day with just cow burps of methane. And so again, all that methane just goes up into the atmosphere and causes global warming. Cows are a significant cause of global warming worldwide, which is incredible. And I think our last slide talking about the causes of global warming and where these greenhouse gases come from is waste management. This comes down to two things: piles of poop and piles of trash. So we'll talk about the poop first. Those cows are, oh, I can't believe I'm talking about this stuff. All right, so those cows, it's so absurd. These cows, they just, if you've never seen a feedlot before, sometimes we just pack like thousands of cows in these tiny areas. And the same goes with pigs and chickens and all this other stuff. And they just poop a lot. Like, I can't describe to you how much a cow poops. It's just like unbelievable amounts. And so we don't really have anything to do with all this poop. And humans, just the geniuses that we are, what we do with it is we basically just flush it into a pond. And so this is called a manure pond. And so pretty much everywhere we have chickens and cows and pigs, we have these big giant poop ponds next to them. And again, that's like, if you're a bacteria, I mean, that is just like, you can't get better than the poop pond to go live in. So these bacteria just teem in here, and there's not a lot of oxygen in the swampy environment again, so these bacteria are producing a whole bunch of methane. And the same goes, the human poop, usually we don't leave it in ponds, but temporarily it will go into ponds and whatnot, and that whole process will create a sizable amount of methane as well. You do contribute very, very slightly to global warming. Every time you fart, you also have these bacteria living in you. Your intestines are also this kind of swampy environment with some food in it, and there's not much oxygen. So yes, your farts are actually mainly methane as well. So you're doing your little part too for global warming. Not nearly as much as a cow. You're probably not filling up 75-gallon trash cans of farts each day. I would hope not. And then finally, piles of trash everywhere. Yes, humans, we generate a lot of trash every day. We have every week we have our trash day. We roll our trash bins out and they take it away somewhere. And where they take it to is a landfill, which is basically a giant trash mountain. And all of our organic stuff that goes in there. So any kind of plant materials, any food materials that go into the trash can and end up in this landfill, what happens is it basically rains on this trash. It's uncovered. Eventually it will get covered up, but it's uncovered at first. And when it rains, this rain kind of percolates down into this trash, and you get this layer of what I like to call dumpster juice. If you've ever been around a dumpster, you know that smell. That's kind of what's going on here. Is you left the dumpster open and it rained overnight, and you get that nice dumpster juice down there. And this is, again, a very swampy environment, and bacteria, oh yeah, they're happy. So this swampy, juicy food and plant and all that stuff and bacteria produces, yep, you know it, a whole bunch of methane that gets bubbled out into the atmosphere. So overall, this ends up being the picture that is created, and it's a pretty complex pie chart that our World in Data created that shows greenhouse gas emissions, not by gas, but by kind of the source of that greenhouse gas. So the overwhelming majority of the greenhouse gases that we produce are through energy, and that's like electricity. That would be energy use in buildings. So a good chunk of that. So we're going to kind of look at the center of this pie chart and then work our way out. So this energy pie is broken down into smaller pies that we can work our way out into. And so you can see a good chunk of this energy pie is electricity. That's basically energy use in buildings. A big chunk is transportation. So that's our cars and our planes and our boats and all that stuff. And then a really big chunk is what they're calling industry. And so again, making steel and iron and metal, all that stuff takes a lot of energy. So does making all the different plastics and chemicals that we depend on. And then this kind of mystery category, other industry, I'm not sure exactly what that's all about. But you can kind of see, okay, so lots and lots of our overall greenhouse gas emissions come from either electricity or transportation, or like, you know, manufacturing using fossil fuels. And so pretty much all this is fossil fuels, this energy slice. Then we get into the agricultural activities, which are about 20% of overall all global warming. Cows on Earth contribute about 6%. So all global warming is it's kind of amazing. But yeah, 6% of global warming is pretty much cow farts and poop. It's absurd. It's absurd. About 4% is agricultural soils. That's kind of what I was talking about, where as we switch from sort of natural forest and grasslands, we are changing the amount of roots in the soil structures. That is a big factor. Rice, there's a rice, crop burning and deforestation. So those kind of burning practices, those make up, you know, pretty sizable chunks as well. And then last but not least, we have our landfills and our wastewater, which is basically trash and human poop. And then concrete, cement is about 3%. And then other chemical production is about 2.2%. So this big picture emerges that, you know, it's not just fossil fuels that cause global warming. It's a lot of things. It's a lot of things. So that hopefully puts the picture together, exactly what is causing this massive spike of methane and carbon dioxide that we're seeing in recent decades. Pretty much everything that humans do. I was kind of laughing. I had this weird thought that, like, if some really super intelligent alien came and visited Earth and they were just like observing humans, they're like, what are these humans trying to accomplish, like, with their day-to-day lives? I think their conclusion would probably be, these humans seem obsessed with generating carbon dioxide and methane. It must be their life goal. Everything they do does it. And that kind of puts in perspective the challenges. If we want to prevent global warming from happening, and again, I think it's really, really bad, and it's just going to get worse and worse, generation from generation. You know, the most obvious way to prevent it from happening is to kind of stop the cause of it, which is greenhouse gases. But then when you start kind of weighing into, okay, so how could we stop this? We have to stop driving all of our cars, no more boats and planes. We need to change how we get electricity or not get electricity at all. We need to stop having cows and stop pretty much farming, stop making concrete and steel and other chemicals and plastics. And then we need to stop putting our trash and our poop in big piles. You're going like, okay, so yeah, pretty much everything we do does create these, and we would probably have to change just about everything with how we do everything to solve this problem. Oh man, okay, are we actually going to solve this problem? And eventually we will get to, okay, is this a solvable problem, and what sorts of things could we do to solve this problem? That'll be the next, not the next lecture, but another few lectures from now. And the next lecture is actually going to be about certain natural processes on Earth that kind of reinforce the bad problems. So hopefully you learned something, and that's it for right now. So until next time, see you guys later.